Hi, Kim. Thank you so much for being on the podcast today.
Thank you so much for having me. I love talking about podcasts.
Yes, me too. So, to begin with, why don't we let the listeners know who is Kim and what does she bring to this world?
Well, that's a very loaded question, and I could go on and on about, but I'll keep it focused on what we're doing here today. I am a Los Angeles book coach. So I help high achievers, coaches, business owners write amazing books. I'm a collaborator with them in the creative process, and then I'm a think tank with them in the publishing process. So I take them through the whole journey. I am a homeowner, I'm a mom, and I'm also a writer.
Awesome. And tell us a little bit more about your podcast. What's it called and why did you start it?
Absolutely. I've always had a dream to be, a talk show host. And the bar to entry for talk show host is high. I'm not giving up on the dream yet, but podcasting just was like a much easier way to go in. And I come from the movie and television business. So technically, it wasn't that big of a reach for me. And I went and, I think I watched some like free videos on how to create a podcast and kind of understood. Originally when you first start, you do it on like Skype with like your regular headphones, and then you're like, doesn't sound that good. And then you advance to the microphone. But just to say, the reason why I started the podcast was that desire to be more of an interviewer. I love interviewing people. I'm told I'm excellent at it, and that I ask a lot of questions that people normally don't ask. And I also, to some degree, wanted to invite people on that I thought needed to hear themselves talk about how they needed to write a book. And some of those people did become clients.
Wow, that's amazing. Yes, I've met like so many amazing people through interviewing podcasts and then learning more about them. Then I go check them out, follow them. I've even listening to a podcast hired a business coach through the podcast because
Right.
she just gave so much free value. Because if somebody gives you all that free value, then you're gonna be like, what would they give me if I actually paid them?
That's a really good point. That's a
Mhm.
really good point. And in a podcast I just recorded yesterday, we were talking about like why people hedge on hiring coaches when the value is so obvious of what they're going to receive. They'd rather sort of stay in the pain for a little bit longer. And that's what they'll do until they can kind of come forward and invest in themselves.
Yes, exactly. So, walk me through a little bit about what fears you had before you started this podcast.
It wasn't so much fear because I really knew I could handle the podcast area in terms of content. I had a lot of like confusion figuring out the title. And I think my first title was something like, the words that inspire you, or something like, it's a, and I ran it by a couple of friends, and they were like, it sounds like you're doing like a religious podcast. It sounds like, a Christian podcast. And, I was like, well, I mean, that's not so, so bad. And they were like, no, you should really have it be with books. And interestingly enough, it was my ex-husband who comes from business development. And I was kind of complaining to him one day. I'm like, I just really can't land on the title. And he's like, well, what do people always say to you? Or what do he goes, I always hear you saying that you say to people, you should write a book about that. He's like, that should be the title. I'm like, oh my God. I'm like, that is like the best title ever. And literally that became the title. And I've never changed it since. So there was that hurdle. And then the other thing that came up for me that really, I'd say about like 40 episodes in, when I switched to a couple streaming platforms, and I'm not going to name them because they didn't work out and I don't want to put a business down. But for me personally, I went on a couple of these like platforms, and the technical started to be so like, it would give me so much anxiety. Like they tell you, oh, if you see the screen glitching on the guest, it's really not glitching. It's just and I'd be like, how in the middle of the interview are you going to stay calm when you see like your guests like refracting? And then there was like one platform that if the guest left before the download happened, the podcast was lost. And then uh, it, that part started to make the podcast not fun for me anymore. And I actually had to stop podcasting for a while, regroup, and just come back on Zoom.
Yes, I know exactly what platform you're talking about. That's why I stick to Zoom. I tell people keep it simple. I've never had an issue with Zoom. It always sounds good as long as you're using your microphone and your
The
headphones.
microphone.
And it's not that expensive. It's what, $15 a month. So yeah, keep it simple. Don't try to get into all the other tech because yeah, I've had the same issue with what you're talking about.
And it became like so stressful. Like I like one interview, like we could, that the woman wasn't on Chrome, and then like we had to sign her back out and sign her back in, and then her sound wasn't working. And I was like, I felt like if it had been Zoom, there would have just been like like you just go to preferences and like you just figure it out. And this felt like there was a third party, and then I'm trying to contact like there, and you're getting flustered in front of your guest, and you feel defeated. You feel
Mhm.
defeated. So I'm
Yeah.
happy to be doing it on Zoom. And the one tip I will give is, and I just figured this out on Zoom, if you save the interview to your computer and not the cloud, you can get the separate audio tracks.
Mhm.
But if you save it to just the cloud, you get the one track, and you can't have your wonderful producer, AKA you, edit out somebody's like breath or a glitch or something like that.
Yes, yes. Yeah, I love 2 tracks because yeah, if the host coughs or something, that's so easy to take out, where if it's 1 track, you gotta leave it in,
Gotta
unless
leave
you
it
take out
in.
exactly what they're saying.
Exactly.
Yeah, and I feel now most people should know how to use Zoom, especially since 2020 happened, so it's other people don't get so flustered either. If they see the Zoom link, they're like, "Oh, I know that. I can jump on
I
there," you
can do
know?
that. Like
Yeah.
that's easy. Like they know to show up. It's having a good mic that I always say to people. And some people can pull it off with their computer audio. I'm not a big fan of AirPods. I feel like it's on an internet frequency and it can be like glitchy. I say to people, and I've texted people the package. I'm like, there's a package with a microphone. And I used to have like the big arm and the pop guard and the whole thing. And now I just set it on a stand now. I just am really simplifying. I like just stand up and just chat.
Yeah, like my microphone was $40 and I think it works great. Like I've never
It
had an
sounds
issue with it.
amazing.
Yeah, you
Yeah, it
don't need to
sounds
get
really good.
all this equipment, you don't need a whole production studio. Like
It's true.
you're good. Yes. And going back to the name of your podcast, I
Sure.
I love it. Like it's straightforward. You know exactly what you're going to get when you click into your podcast. It's going to be about authors and writing a book. So I love it.
And interestingly enough, the first half of the podcast is not about books at all. It's about the value that that person brings to the world. And then halfway through the podcast, I'm like, so why aren't you writing a like you're so informed. And you know what, Jillian? I just realized I actually don't have that model. I really should like be moving into that model. You just gave me like the best brainstorm live. It's like I have been showing the guest and then going into the book conversation, but it just dawned on me that I should be calling them out more about like, so you just told me how amazing you are and how many people you want to reach. Why is there no book? All right, that's it. That's my new, thank you.
Yes. Yes, you should.
New model for
Yes.
2023 starts
There you go.
next
See,
guest.
we're always growing. I always say, if your first podcast is as good as your 100th, then what have you learned? Like, what are you
What have you
doing? You're
learned?
not learning anything. Like, you should constantly be growing and learning and evolving your podcast.
Yes. And you come into your voice too. Like I know like my first 30 podcasts, like were very scripted and everything. And now I do script. I write out all the questions. I do a lot of thinking beforehand and I flow, but I'm not frightened to go off in another direction. Like if somebody says something that I didn't expect, I'm like, wait a minute, like let's take that. And then 6 questions are just gone because we just like got into some stuff that I really want to talk about. And somehow I am able to always wrap it at like 30 minutes. And people are always like, oh my God, that was like so fast. That was so easy. We could have talked for hours. And I'm like, yeah, but nobody wants to hear us talk for hours. That's the thing.
Hmm.
They're already bored, you know?
Yeah. Yeah. I found that like 30 minutes is like the max most people want to listen to a
Max.
podcast.
Unless you're
That's
like Joe Rogan,
I
or
know.
like someone famous, then they'll
Yes.
listen to you like go on and on and on.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. But I do the same thing. Like I have my list of questions here, but yeah, if we go in another direction, we go in another direction,
That's
it's
right.
not, yeah. And you just kind of keep track of the time, and try to wrap it up near the 30-minute mark.
Exactly. Exactly.
Yep. So in what ways are you growing your podcast? How is it evolving?
That is a really good and painful question for the beginning of 2023 because I don't have a game plan and I really should have one. I've gotten very loosey goosey where if I meet someone, and I always do, I do one every 2 weeks. I'm very like relaxed about it. It's just like if I have a conversation with someone that I think should be public, that's my new meter. Like, oh, we just had this private conversation that I really think a lot more people need to hear. That's the meter. But really, the best growth just came from this interview where I'm like, I'm going to change the model where I challenge them more. And that might even mean changing the intro where I say, today we're going to talk with da da da, and we're going to prove how important they are to the world. And then we're going to figure out why they haven't written a book. And maybe it's like, should be more of a controversial, like, oh, you don't really want to be on Kim O'Hara's podcast. She's going to like call you out about not writing that book. That might be the new model. Because so far it's been like this combo of like clients that have written books, which is fine because they need to talk about their process and they need to talk about their process with me for people that want to write a book. But then there's this sort of middle road people that are like, I don't even really know if they like want to, I think they want to write a book. I've identified that, but it's not so like hard pressing. So it could go into like more of like an antagonistic, like controversial direction. But aside from that, I did rebrand the look and I did make it a podcast by a writer for writers. I think that was the big shift for me at the end of 22, where I realized I've been writing for 30 years and I am highly qualified as a writer to know writers. Like I know them so well. I'm in pain as a writer all the time. So I really wanted to differentiate that I'm a writer interviewing these writers too, even though I'm a coach.
Mhm. Yeah, exactly. And I like that you want to call people out. Like, I feel like maybe it's the kick in the butt some people need, like, to actually get it done. Because, we all talk down to ourselves and say, I can't do that. Like, who wants to read a book I wrote? But yeah, I think you just
Yes.
highlighting their brilliance, highlighting why they need to do this, why they're so awesome. Like, people always love to hear why they're awesome. Like,
Right.
just help motivate them to do that.
Right. And I could open the podcast with like, okay, so we're going to get to why you haven't written a book yet. But first, we're going to talk about how amazing you are so that we can like understand you need to write a book.
Yes.
And I need to do that. Like I need to write that down. Okay, I'll do it when we're done.
Okay.
Remind me when you're
Okay. And that actually answers my next question because I was going to ask, what's the future of your podcast? But we see where it's going now.
we're doing collaboration right
Oh,
here,
yes.
like real
Real
time. So I
time.
hope people are like excited. So if you get a call to be on my podcast, get ready.
Yes.
I also think too, like, I would like to do more standalones, but because the podcast is called, like, my biggest received episode was where I just talked about writing. That's the one that's received the most downloads, thousands of downloads. And yet I don't seem compelled to do it again. I'm not sure why. I've sort of lost the like thread of that. And that's something I'd like to bring back in 2023. I started a column called the Inner Circle column. And it's really about me telling stories, giving technology tips, saying something I'd like to see invented, and like a tip on writing. And I feel like I need to bring that into the podcast. And maybe this year there needs to be like a branding integration of that column and the podcast. Cause, I do want like a media conglomerate someday.
Yeah, that sounds amazing. Yeah, I don't think I've heard you. I'll have to go listen to that episode. Like, I haven't heard the
Yeah,
solo one.
it's a
Yeah.
real yes, it's gotten like a lot of hits. So I don't even remember what it's called. It's something about like the authorship or the fundamentals of authorship or something like that. So
Yeah, I will definitely go check that out. So, what would be your like number one tip if somebody wants to start a podcast and start getting their voice out there, even if they want to write a book and get their voice out there, because that's still your voice. It's just in written form. What's your number one tip for them?
I would say really know why you're doing the podcast. Like, really understand who. I say this about books all the time when authors come to me, is I make them really think about, like, who is your reader? And because you're ultimately writing for the reader at the end of the day. And if you don't know who your reader is, then you are just going to be lost in the dark a lot of times when you're trying to discern what kind of content to put in the book. So I'd say with the podcast, like, initially know, who are you doing the podcast for? Why are they listening? Like, what is it what need are you filling? Like, what are you bringing them? Are you bringing them like life affirming, objectives? Do you want them to laugh? Do you want them to cry? Like, because people have such limited time that, a lot of times when I do my podcast, I'll be like the first one to admit, even though I think it's like the best episode and like I think it would be amazing to listen to it, I have a hard time imagining like someone's going to put 30 minutes of their day aside and listen to my podcast. Like, I totally admit that. Like, sometimes I'm like, I don't know, like, sounds good to me. I mean, so I feel like if you're going to do a podcast, really like be on fire about who is listening and visualize them. Be like, who are they? Why are they listening? What is the experience they're having right now with me and my voice?
Hmm. Yes, I always do that with guest episodes, I record an intro and an outro, and I always talk directly to my ideal listener, why they should listen, how this is going to help them. Just give it to them straightforward and let them know why they need
Right.
to listen to it.
Right. Right.
Mhm.
Exactly. Exactly. And I think that's something that we've unearthed for me today, is that sort of, why is someone listening to this? Well, maybe they're listening to the podcast because they're on the fence about writing a book, and they hear all this other person making all these excuses that they're like, oh, that person should totally be writing a book. And they're like, wait, who am I to say that? Like, I'm not writing my book. So maybe that is the switch, because I know I did an Instagram post the other day where I basically said straight up, I'm a book coach. If you call me and you complain about why you're not writing a book, just stop, because I'm literally going to be like, that's kind of what I do for a living. So maybe like you might want to complain to someone else. I don't know.
Yeah, it makes sense. Yes. I don't know why they would come to you just to complain about.
I know. And that's like if I went to you and I was like, Jillian, I don't know what's going on. Like, I can't seem to get my podcast like recorded and like edited and out there. You'd be like, I'm a podcast producer. I'd be
Yeah.
like, oh, but still, it's like, why?
Yeah. That's funny. So, well, thank you so much for being on today. This was a really good conversation, and I'm very excited to see the direction that your podcast is going in.
Me too.
Yes, and I do have to say I feel very lucky that I get to listen to it first before other
Thank
people.
you.
So, how can our listeners connect more with you? Obviously, your podcast, but how else can they connect with you?
Well, I just rebranded this year, and I'd love people to go to my website to justify the cost I had on it. It's KimO'Hara.com. Really easy, really simple. KimO'Hara.com. And on there, you can click on and subscribe to my column called Inner Circle. They're funny. They're great. Like, I really get a lot of it's grown even faster than my podcast. And, Instagram, Kim O'Hara Coach. You know, it's like I'm super out there. Like, if
Yes.
you can't find me, then you live under a rock, is all I have
Yeah.
to say.
Yes. I know you're on Facebook, LinkedIn, Twitter. I know all the places.
Everything.
Yes.
Everything. I'm like posted these 9 places. You're like, okay.
Yes. But I will make sure that is all in the show notes, of course.
Thank you.
Yes. And thank you again so much.
You're welcome. Thanks for having me.